I'm
So,
sitting here with the Klein family, and they have a very interesting story that is a part of world history. Would you mind explaining who you two are?
I'm Ruth Klein, Ruth Ann Klein, and
I'm Thomas A. Gifford.
his mother, Mary Klein, and my father, Bill Klein, were brother and sister.
Yep.
So, it all started before his mom was born with my father and our 5 aunts and uncles back in the 30s.
Yeah.
My dad was 5, and they came down with something. They had to get their tonsils out in the hospital.
Exactly.
The five of the 6 kids. It was Margaret Ann, Ruth Marie, Ed, my father, Bill, and Joe. No, Joe stayed at home. Joe was the baby. Uncle Leonard. Uncle Leonard. So all 5 of them ended up having their tonsils out in the hospital, and
approximately all the same time.
at the same time.
Yeah.
And they ended up getting the first case history of 5 children in one family coming down with infantile paralysis,
Yeah.
which was now known as polio, but then they didn't know where the disease came from or why. People were getting it and why it attacked only one child in families.
But it was
And
the first cases in polio that had more than 3 children involved in the same family at that time.
right,
Which was worldwide news.
right, worldwide news.
And it was the first discovery of polio, and actually how it was first discovered and known to be spread.
Right. They found out that it could be an airborne virus because there was a child in Akron Children's Hospital at the time that had infantile paralysis at the same time that my father, Bill, and his 4 other siblings got their tonsils out, 5 of them at the same time. So Bill, Leonard,
Joe.
No, Joe was the baby and at home. Ed,
And
Ruth, Margaret Ann, and Ruth Marie
Margaret Ann.
all came down with infantile paralysis, and 3 of them died. The oldest 3 died. The 14-year-old Ed, 13-year-old, and 12-year-old, the 2 girls, Margaret and Ruth. And so Uncle Leonard and my father Bill were the 2 alive. And the stories are my grandma would go in and sing. Our grandma would go in and sing to the boys. After she lost 2 kids already, she would go in and sing to them, fearful that she was going to lose these other 2 also.
She lost
3 in 2 days.
In 2 days, and 2 surviving children. After she lost 3, in 2 days' time, she would go back to the 2 surviving children
and sing to them so that they would feel comfort, not knowing they lost their siblings at all. My dad said he had no clue that his brother and 2 sisters had died.
She didn't tell
No.
She didn't tell the other 2.
So Tom and I grew up not knowing much about it until around my father got sick. We started looking at family history and found some scrapbooks. And we found a handwritten letter from President Roosevelt to our grandma Ruth Klein, maiden name Bennett.
Exactly.
And thanking her for her sacrifice of those 3 children to be
making nationwide news and alerting to them to the fact of the discovery
infantile paralysis was an airborne virus.
And also alerting them to polio and obviously a cure.
Well, it took a few years until they got not a cure, never a cure,
but leading
vaccination.
The way to vaccination for the polio disease.
Right. So she sacrificed those 3 children that died, their bodies to science so that they could do studies.
It was a huge major discovery in the world of medical history.
Right. And it brought about a lot more hand washing with soap.
And it was a handwritten letter from President Roosevelt.
To Grandma Ruth, thanking her for her sacrifice of the 3 that had passed away, their bodies to be able to be experimented and scientifically find out what the infantile paralysis, how it was spread. And the 2 that were still alive had a long road to go still, because although They used a lot of experimental drugs to halt and remission the infantile paralysis at the time. Uncle Leonard ended up having it in his legs and my father in his arms. So
Yes.
both of them were through a lot of surgeries, through a lot of experimental medications.
Uncle Leonard had trouble. He hadn't learned how to walk again.
Literally.
And this is in the 1930s?
1930s, early 40s.
Yeah, Daddy was.
The letter was signed and dated. My mother has a copy of
My
it.
daddy was born in
Scrapbook.
33, and he was
Leonard
5
was-
years old, so it was 1938, the year he got polio,
Right.
infantile paralysis.
And the letter that I saw in my mother's scrapbook was dated from Washington, D.C. The postmark on it was dated in Washington, D.C., 1939.
1939, so
And-
that was a year after all that. And that's when the March of Dimes approached our grandmother Ruth.
Exactly.
Our grandpa Tony refused to have any name known. He was embarrassed. He was humiliated. He felt when they put the quarantine sign up on their door and everyone in the neighborhood knew where they.
But it also had a huge launching and huge big thing to do because Grandma Ruth was named first woman ever
Mother of the Year.
Mother of the Year for the March of Dimes.
Right, and it got
Ever.
a lot of
And
publicity.
it got a lot of publicity
for children's
for
hospitals.
children's hospitals and the March of Dimes organization, which got huge after that, nationwide publicity after that, and helped the organization.
Ultimately,
thousands.
ultimately a vaccination was made. They named the virus polio. It was no longer known as infantile paralysis. They started calling it polio, and they started immediately mass vaccinating children all over the United States. I don't know how Europe dealt with the vaccination at the time, but there's been no more cases since that era in our United States
It was a
history.
huge movement in the medical field.
Well, it
throughout the
vaccinated
United States.
millions and millions and millions
In the
still to this
late
day.
1930s.
My uncle got polio, though, and he's
Well,
not
we're not
born till
saying
the
it
50s.
Cured or it didn't completely cure. Not everyone was vaccinated.
Right, he got
But it was a
polio,
major movement.
but he
throughout
may
the
have
United
also
States.
gotten it from the
In the medical
vaccination because the
Not
vaccination
everyone
ended up
was
being a
vaccinated.
live virus, and it
We're not
says
saying
one in
everyone
every how many ever thousand
It went
can
a
be
long way.
susceptible
Yeah.
to getting the disease from the vaccination. Polio is the one vaccination that they give through the mouth orally, and that they
But
say
there's
it
other
is a
ways you
live
can-
virus. You have to
can
keep them
get it.
away from elderly people when they get that
There's a number
vaccination
of
and
other
anyone who's sick.
You could get polio in different other ways.
But now, with all those experimental drugs that they did on
100%.
Uncle Leonard and my dad Bill, they can stop it. They can't cure polio,
They can't-
but they
there's
can
no
stop it
100%.
from killing people. There's no more death
To a
and
certain
loss of life to
Too-
it. There's handicap, but not. The numbers have been down to 1 in 1,000.
We can just add to that. Can't cure.
Right.
There's
So,
no-
Grandpa Tony refused any recognition, no matter whether President Roosevelt wrote his family or not. He was so broken
It was a major
from the
step.
loss.
it's a major
He was so broken that it tore the family apart. He ended up, they had 3 more children.
Oh, it's because he was so
Aunt
against
Therese, then Aunt
He
Mary,
didn't want
then Aunt
this.
Evelyn, and Aunt Mary's his mother. And those 3 children, when Grandma Ruth died of a brain aneurysm, went to live with the Bennetts. Went to live with Grandma Ruth Bennett's brother and his wife. And your mom, Mary,
In
and Evelyn,
Toledo.
and Therese were raised there.
In Toledo, Ohio.
So, ever since then, we've
Like
had
cleaning up
a
a mess.
family problem of a rare blood type and no elevated white blood cells show. And they don't know why. We've all had appendix problems because they do a blood test to see if there's any elevated white blood cells, which shows infection in your body. And my brother Raymond has had exploratory surgery from top to bottom. My sister Laura's perforated her appendix. Mine almost ruptured. A cyst on my ovary did rupture. They never caught any of that through our blood or elevated white blood cells because,
Our cousin Paul had his appendix removed because it burst.
right, it burst. But most of the time they can find these things out through a blood test, a simple blood test to show elevated white
but it
blood
works.
cells.
His mother just thought he had a real bad stomachache. But after 3 days on the couch and toilet pain, we finally took him in. And, thank God that it didn't leak in his the rest of his
That's what happened to
internal systems.
my sister Laura.
But it completely had burst, and he's got one hell of a scar. You know,
Because whatever
he got
medication or drugs they experimented on, my father and that with, and whatever vaccination they ended up giving to our grandmother or whatever, when the polio vaccination did come in effect way back in the early 30s before they had perfected everything, it's changed our blood makeup. I believe mine from my father's, all of his medication, all of the things that they did with his
and
polio.
I donated blood plasma, and whenever I've gone into blood plasma center and hurt my finger, I've waited 5 to 10 minutes, and then immediately put me to the front of the line.
It's O positive.
I believe
Almost
that it
every
is.
one of us has O positive
They
blood,
put me right through front of the line, right in the seat.
which is very rare
Gave me
also
top
for a whole
dollar,
family. A
top
whole
dollar.
family to have O positive is very
I
rare.
believe it is. And I think that's just family trait or something. I don't know. But it could have been, like she said,
From our
because,
grandparents.
you know, our grandparents and whatnot, they were injected with whatever it was.
Experimental medication
Experimental medicine.
before they found out and named it polio. So the K family, even it's Grandma Ruth Bennett, which married a Klein, so
Right.
it's the Klein Bennett McHenry, and
And
his mom was
Giffen,
raised Mary Klein,
Klein,
and then
Giffen.
married into Giffen. That's
Right.
why you're Giffen. But there's a lot of us, and
Still
that
Klein, you
out
know,
of
maybe-
100 cousins, first cousins,
Right,
there's 2 that have passed away.
right. Only 2.
Right.
And that's only because my brother had brain surgery and lost half his brain, cancer. You know, and he fought like hell.
And Laura, they just found her dead on the floor of a heart attack. So who knows? Who knows? It's a strong
But
family.
that, I mean, other than
lots
that,
of lots
out of
and lots of strong
you know,
blood.
hundreds of first cousins alone, that in of itself, right there, hundreds of first cousins in itself would speak for itself just alone in any
Longevity.
family. How many,
But
you know,
our family in the sacrifice that our grandma Ruth made was never recognized because her husband
well,
wouldn't allow it.
exactly.
Her husband would not allow it.
Wow.
So we
We
just
look,
wanted
you know,
people to know what a
Right.
courageous and awesome woman our grandma Ruth was
Right.
to sacrifice those
And
3
to do
children
that.
that she already lost and to be so strong to raise those 2 other ones to be
Right.
such phenomenal men. My dad was an awesome man in my life.
Exactly.
I know as your Uncle Bill, he made a big impact on yours too.
Yes.
He was a good man.
But we just want the truth to be known and be out there
Right.
because, you know,
My dad ended up dying in the hospital of septic because they couldn't find an infection in his body.
her
And they
grandpa
wouldn't
her
listen to
grandpa
anything we said about the blood.
and her grandpa wouldn't allow it. You know,
Yeah.
and we don't think that's right.
No.
Period. And her grandma was Woman of the Year. You can look it
Your
up.
grandma too.
Our grandma was named Woman of the
First
Year.
Mother of the Year.
First Mother of the Year for March
March
of
of
Dimes.
Dimes.
And you can look it up. And what was her name again? Gotta get
Ruth.
this right.
Ruth Klein, but she was Maiden Bennett.
Ruth
Bennett.
Bennett / Klein. Maiden name Bennett, last name Klein. First March of Dimes Woman of the Year. Look it
Yeah.
up.
Wow. So
You
the
track
March of
our
Dimes developed
complete.
out of
They
what
were
happened to
starting-
your
they were
family?
starting to get on
They were
their
starting to
feet
get
at that
on
time
their
in the
feet
early
at that time.
30s because of so many
But
children
It
coming
basically put them on the map.
handicapped with
It basically put them on the
infantile
map.
paralysis, paralyzing parts of their bodies. The ones that
Yes.
didn't have any major organs that did survive the horrendous disease
Right.
were left handicapped because it would either paralyze their arms or their legs or their ability to speak, and
Yeah.
they were left handicapped. So the March of Dimes developed because there was so much
They
need.
were already there.
For the handicapped
They were
society.
already in place.
I've
We're not
supported
saying-
March of Dimes like basically my whole life.
but
Like I
basically-
really do respect that organization.
When
Right.
this happened, it basically put March of Dimes front page news on the map.
Right. People
Nationwide.
started knowing more
They
about
were
other
already
than
there. We're not saying they
other
weren't
than
already
people
there
that
in the
needed their
steps. We're not
services.
saying that.
People didn't know much
But
about them
people did
unless
not
they
know
had a
much about
handicapped child or someone who
But
needed March of Dimes help.
when-
People didn't know much about them.
When this happened, and because
And they
it got
started doing the Jerry
national
Lewis
coverage,
telethons then, and I think
That was
the
muscular.
that was
muscular
dystrophy,
dystrophy
yeah.
in the 70s.
That's different. That was way different. That was Jerry Lewis. That's completely different. Let's not get off topic.
Oh,
But
March
when
of
this
Dimes never
happened-
did any kind of telethon or
They
anything.
No,
did.
they.
like
I,
that?
No,
I
they
always
did.
supported them through
They
their
did.
mailing of the Easter
They
seal
did.
sit
Oh,
stamps.
that's what it is.
And
Easter
that,
seals.
yes.
They were
Yeah,
completely
see, I
different.
wasn't born until
See,
70s,
right. They
so
were Easter seals. That's completely different. But March of Dimes was still. They were there before this incident happened and everything like that. They were solid. They were there. So we can't say that they weren't.
right. They
But
just hadn't nominated or
once-
had any Mother of the Year or
Once
anything like
this
that.
event happened, this really put March of
Because
Dimes
how can you
in
pick
the
out of all those
spotlight
mothers when
nationwide.
each one of them has
Haven't
lost
seen
a child?
Exactly.
But when Grandma lost three in 2 days and
That
had
was
two more
big
fighting for their
nationwide.
life and still kept her
And
spirits
it's
up.
because
So your
March of
family
Dimes
was the
helpful.
first family
really
to
stepped
have
in
come
help.
down with 5 children in one family.
With infantile
with
paralysis.
infantile.